as not backing up an ally that has been an ally of the United States for 30 years. It's going to undermine confidence in countries like Jordan, for example, Saudi Arabia. So this is a very serious matter as to how they handle it.
Well, as far as you're concerned, it's clear then, is it, that what they should be doing is, as you just put it, backing up an ally, in this case Hosni Mubarak?
You don't have, look, the United States, when there were hundreds of thousands of people in Tehran trying to, in a sense, upend the regime in Tehran, the United States said nothing. There was a reason for that, okay? Here they have to be very careful what they say, because however it happens, if the choice is not between Mubarak and democracy, frankly, it's between Mubarak and the Muslim League. And the United States has to be very careful not to create conditions that make it possible for the Muslim League to there. If there is going to be change, and there has to be change, it has to be managed very carefully.
Well, you've thrown forward a couple of ideas there that I need to unpick, but let's just start with this idea that the Americans still have a duty to offer their support to Mubarak. Let me just quote to you what Hillary Clinton said after the first couple of days of rage on the streets of Cairo. She said, quote, "Our assessment is the Egyptian government is stable and is looking for ways to respond to the legitimate needs of the Egyptian people." Well, then we saw the tanks, we saw the Egyptian police snipers on the top of the Interior Ministry, we saw more than 100 people killed. What was she talking about?
Well, I mean, you know what she's saying, obviously. She's saying in some form or another, we would like somehow or other to support the Mubarak administration or regime, call it what you will, but in the context of their responding to what's going on the street in terms of opening up the economy and opening up the political system. That, it seems to me, is a perfectly legitimate response from the Secretary of State.
But there is nothing at all to suggest that Hosni Mubarak, after 30 years of repressive tactics, of anti-democratic strategy, is the guy to deliver that what they're now calling in the United States, quote unquote, the orderly transition to democracy.
Well, let me just put it this way. We've seen that movie before, okay? It was Iran. We did not support the Shah of Iran and his government, okay? We ended up with a radical regime in Iran, which has now been the most destabilizing factor in the entire Middle East. The last thing in the world we would need to have is to have something, a radical Islamist group like the Muslim Brotherhood, take over in Egypt, which will have enormous damage to American interests.
Okay,
it'll threaten Jordan, etc.
I'm going to stop you for a moment.
Please.
We've been speaking for 3 minutes or so, and already you've made at least 2 references to the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic groups in Egypt. They are not in the lead in this particular popular uprising. You've seen the pictures just as well as I have. The Muslim Brotherhood is not leading the young Egyptians onto the streets of Cairo and other cities.
I agree. But that's not the only issue. The fact is, what's going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or the week after tomorrow? The Muslim League is recognized to be the best organized, the best financed, and if there's no Mubarak regime there, the Iranians will provide them with huge amounts of money to try and, in a sense, take over the country. There was an election, if you recall, not the previous sort of congressional election, but the one to their parliament earlier. The Muslim League was the overwhelming winner in that election. So it is clear they have the broadest amount of political support.
Do you believe in democracy, Mr. Zuckerman?
Totally.
Totally?
Yes.
Without question?
Yes.
In the Middle East?
No, well, the Middle East, look, the Middle East is a culture where
it's rather important, isn't it? Either you believe in democracy or you don't. Either you let the people of the Gaza Strip or of Egypt or of any other Arab country have the vote, have an expression of popular will, or you don't.
No, I'm sorry. You know, in China, for example, they've had an authoritarian government for 5,000 years. That is a part of their culture. The culture of the Middle East is not by definition democratic. So it's going to be an evolutionary process for them to get to a democracy. I do not want to see what might happen, and the risks are great, to have the Muslim Brotherhood take over in Egypt. And I don't think the Egyptian population are, if you have that kind of an election, you may end up with the Muslim Brotherhood. From the point of view, at least of the West, and in my judgment of the United States, that would be a disaster.
You see, what we have with that view, and you obviously don't speak for the American government, but you're an influential commentator, you own newspapers, you've sat at the very top of American Jewish organizations, you carry some weight in Washington, and what you seem to be suggesting to me is that America cannot afford to let this expression of popular will take place in what has always been a strategic ally, Egypt.
No, I think you are slightly appropriating what I'm trying to say here. There is going to be change in Egypt. There has to be change in Egypt. Nobody denies that. That change has to be managed. You have to make sure that the end...
You use this word manage. You think it's up to Washington, do you, to manage change in Egypt?
Nor do I think it's up to Washington to undermine the Mubarak government, if that's the case, okay?
The Mubarak government being undermined by the people on the streets of Cairo.
There is going to be a change in that government. I mean, for example, one change is who's going to succeed Mubarak. It's no longer going to be his son. There are going to be consequences of this no matter what happens.
Do you think it would be acceptable for it to be Omar Suleiman, do you, the Director of Intelligence, a man who has been loyal to the United States and indeed to Egypt's relationship with Israel for so many years that many Egyptians see him as a puppet of Washington?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I know that might be said. I have no way of measuring that. All I'm saying is that there has to be change in that government. I couldn't agree more. But it has to be a managed change. It can't be a radical change that'll happen in a way that produces the Muslim Brotherhood. We've got to find some alternative approach to change in that country other than ending up with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, you keep talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. Why is it, do you think, that Mohammed al-Baradei, who has been a top UN official, run the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, a man who's gone back to Egypt, it seems, to try to lead an opposition movement, why is it that he says that the US strategy and its relationship with Mubarak no longer has any credibility as far as the Egyptian people are concerned?
Well, he may or may not be right. He has a self-interest. He was running for office in that country.
Well, with all due respect, the regime had told him he wasn't allowed to run for the presidency against Mubarak in 2011. So he had a fundamental problem. His point is that there is a deep desire for genuine democracy in Egypt. It has nothing to do with the particular interests of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is a much wider issue, and he's saying that America is thwarting that genuine democratic drive.
I mean, I think that's a very easy thing for him to say, with all due respect to Mr. Baradei. All I'm saying here is that we in the United States have a major interest in who is in that country and who is in power in that country. It is the absolute bedrock of all of our interests in the region. If Mubarak was overthrown in a radical way, it would threaten Jordan, it would threaten Saudi Arabia, it would threaten the Emirates. These are things that we have to take into account. I am not opposed to change. I'm not opposed to democracy. I am saying when you move from what that government has been for thousands of years, which is not a democracy really, into what we hope will be some kind of a democracy, you have to, at least if you are concerned with your own interests, you have to help get to that way without taking on the risk that the Muslim Brotherhood will take over that country. We've been there, as I said. We saw what happened in Iran. We couldn't have that happen again. It would be disaster for the United States.
The one country you didn't mention when you went through the list of interests that the US has in the Middle East which would be jeopardized by Egyptian democracy, the one country you didn't mention was Israel.
Yes.
There are many people in the Arab world, but actually there are many people in the United States as well who would say that for too long now, US policy region-wide has been skewed because of a preoccupation with Israel and not upsetting the Israeli government.
Well, there are people who feel that way, and there is some truth to that. I mean, I don't have to share that view for all kinds of good reasons.
You said there's some truth to it. Where do you think the truth lies?
Well, I think there has been an effort, not a very good effort, to find a way to resolve, for example, the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, something I've been working on for 15 years, something that I worked on with President Clinton, for example, and it hasn't yet worked. So there's no doubt but that Israel has, as a democracy and as a real democracy, there are real cultural and values ties to the United States and political ties, etc., that's been going on for 50 years. I happen to support that view. It is not inconsistent with developing the kinds of democracies you want to have. One of the groups that would be threatened, for example, if Egypt turned the way I fear, would be, in fact, Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, which I happen to believe is a legitimate kind of authority to represent the Palestinians in their dealings with Israel and in their governing of their country.
Yes, interesting, actually, if we're talking about Mahmoud Abbas, that the Palestinians, when they were given the chance to vote 4 or 5 years ago, actually voted by a majority in their parliament for Hamas, and that's the origin of the split between Fatah and Hamas. Hamas, of course, having a mandate and also now controlling the Gaza Strip.
Yes, they did get a majority in the Gaza Strip, but it is interesting now because the organization that I'm involved with, which is the Institute for Peace, the International Peace we've done polling in Gaza. Hamas is much less popular in Gaza because of the way they've run that. It's exactly what we don't want to have in Egypt, which is a government like Hamas.
Just seems to me that this entire conversation has been premised on one emotion that comes from the United States, comes from yourself, maybe comes from the Obama administration right now. That emotion is fear. There is a fundamental fear of what might happen if Arabs are allowed to express their own democratic will. There's a fear of either jihadi Islamism, there's a fear maybe of a resurgence of Nasserite Arab nationalism, but either way, it is a deeply negative fear. Are there no positive things you can see in this?
No, I don't think that's fair. I mean, the United States legitimately has to be concerned with what happens to that particular region. They are a critical region in the entire world. You have, as I say, a country like Iran, where the United States had a similarly legitimate concern. And look what we have now. You have a country with developing nuclear weapons, with an enormous amount of energy and money and hostility to the rest of the Arab world, that is the moderate Arab world. We have to be concerned about that. It is the source of the energy of the world, and we absolutely cannot just ignore it. So it becomes important who are the governments in these countries. It's a legitimate national interest of the United States.
Of course it is, but